This is part one of a special series with Erik Townsend, taken from conversations I had with him over the course of a week. We're breaking down the future of energy, what's happening with advanced nuclear, and why it matters now more than ever. Let's jump in. Welcome to another episode of Exploring Prosperity. Today's conversation tackles one of the most important questions for our future. How do we continue advancing human prosperity without choking off the energy growth that's lifted billions from poverty? For too long, the dominant narrative has framed climate change as a battle against fossil fuels, but suppressing energy use risks reversing centuries of progress. Instead, the real solution must be replacing fossil fuels with better, more scalable sources of energy. For non-experts like myself, though, assessing the future of nuclear energy can be extremely muddled. Many experts promote their favored technologies while bashing others, making it difficult to separate real breakthroughs from hype. That's why I'm so glad to have Erik Townsend on as my guest today. Erik has spent his career deeply immersed in technology, macroeconomics and markets, and recently global energy. He's also the articulate and easy to understand host of Macrovoices, one of the leading podcasts for sophisticated investors. His work cuts through complexity, and his latest predictions have already been validated by recent events. Just in the last month, two major breakthroughs have elevated the conversation around next-generation nuclear, as exemplified by Saturday's All In podcast that featured these two announcements. First, in March, China confirmed it's been successfully operating a thorium-spectrum molten salt reactor, a technology Erik has advocated as the key to abundant, affordable, safe nuclear energy. And then just last week, it was revealed that China holds over 1 million tons of thorium reserves in Mongolia, reportedly enough to power China for 60,000 years. Erik has just completed a 3-part essay series on his Substack where he explains the history, technology, and profound geopolitical implications of these developments. I highly recommend these to anyone who wants to dive deeper into the details behind our conversation today. Erik, welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. You've poured immense time and energy into researching and advocating for advanced nuclear solutions. What sparked your passion for energy policy, and what motivates you to focus so intensely on this issue?
To help people understand how I got to this point in life, my first career was in software. I was a software entrepreneur, did pretty well, managed to cash out of the software business in the late 90s. That was the beginning of the most unsatisfying chapter of my life, because what I discovered was that wealth is overrated. It solves a bunch of problems, creates a bunch of new ones. So I want my next venture to actually do something meaningful to make the world a better place. I see very clearly for what the world needs to do in order to solve its energy problems and get the rest of the world to see it. I really hope I can get that message out, and I'm looking forward to this podcast as a place to start doing it, because you've done a fantastic job, Bob, of just taking some of my work, and you wrote the Substack breaking down my videos that I did over Christmas time and so forth. So I really appreciate that.
I got the bug listening to you, and during your podcast over the last few years, you've spoken about this from time to time, and then when you put those two out, it really connected with me as part of my work, looking at what is, we're very pessimistic as Americans, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But there are some things that people are missing that could cause some reason for pessimism. And one of them is really this energy per capita that you highlight, and we'll get to that in a minute. But energy is something that people are not really understanding how important it is that we find a solution to our energy needs, especially now that AI is kicking in.
Well, something I thought was interesting is in your little monologue just introducing me, you encapsulated most of the answer just in the introduction, which is, you said, this battle against fossil fuels is misplaced. What we're trying to do, what this Just Stop Oil movement that has, thousands or millions of people around the world passionate and engaged, what are they trying to do? They're trying to phase out fossil fuels before phasing in a viable replacement. That's crazy. And I'm for getting rid of fossil fuels as much as the next guy. The way you do that is you make clean, renewable energy that we can depend on for the next several generations. And I would argue, even though a lot of people don't classify it that way, although old school nuclear might not be considered a renewable energy source, advanced nuclear is more renewable than renewable.
This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Truflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $34 trillion in debt. Truflation collects over 13 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at truflation.com. We're proud to be sponsored by Foundation. They've created Passport, one of the top-rated Bitcoin hardware wallets, proudly made in the USA. It's fully open source and air-gapped, meaning your Bitcoin stays completely offline and secure. The shocking Bybit exchange hack shows why holding some Bitcoin offline diversifies risk. Now they're launching Passport Prime, your all-in-one solution for not only Bitcoin, but all passwords and 2FA security. Head to foundation.xyz to secure your digital future.
There's enough thorium out there that we would run out of rare earth elements to make the magnets for the wind turbines before you would run out of thorium to run the planet on. So it's true that we do need to get away from uranium-235 as the only nuclear fuel that we use, but nuclear energy could be far more renewable than the renewables are. But more important than that is we got to get the general public out of this negative energy battle mindset. Let's go to war with oil. Let's stop oil. Well, wait a minute. Let's find a better replacement for oil. And as soon as we have one, oil will go away all by itself.
Well, and ironically, this sows the seeds of the opposition to the climate change movement, is that it hands the opposition the argument that we need to continue to supply energy for the developing world, and in particular, much less the developed world.
Well, and there's a very fundamental premise that we needed to be responsible and conserve energy, or we needed, to reduce carbon emissions. Well, those are very, very laudable goals, but somehow it hypnotized the general populace into this idea that energy consumption is bad. The opposite is true. Human prosperity is a function of the amount of abundant energy that's available to the economy. Now, it's true that if consuming energy also requires or involves polluting the environment and releasing greenhouse gases and damaging the planet, that's a bad thing. We got to stop doing that crap. But there's nothing wrong with consuming clean, renewable, green energy that's abundant and can last forever. The way that we can lift billions more people around the world out of poverty is to increase global energy consumption dramatically. But in order to do that responsibly, we've also got to get rid of all the carbon emissions and stop polluting as we do it. All of that's possible, but for some reason, we stopped advancing the technology that makes it possible in the early 1970s. We got to get that back on track. I think Chris Wright, our new energy secretary, is exactly the right man to do it.
Why don't we set the stage a little bit and talk about this idea that energy matters for growth, and that overall economic development and growth is a healthy phenomenon, not an unhealthy one.
Bob, let's start with 250 years ago. We all lived approximately like what you see on the screen here. Everybody lived and worked on farms because there was literally no alternative to relying on our own human labor in order to grow the food that we needed just to survive.
I'd add that one of my previous guests, Dr. Jared Rubin, an economic historian and author of a great book called How the World Became Rich, pointed out that in the year 1820, about the time of this painting, 90% of humanity was born into poverty, which I think is important to keep in mind given that today it's only 8%.
Well, what happened? What's different that makes today, where we live in modern cities, that allows us to live a completely different lifestyle than they lived 250 years ago? Most people would say technology is the big thing that changed. Technology is just the inventions that put energy to work in order to make our lives better. Energy itself is the essential ingredient. And one of the things that's happened, and I think you encapsulated this right in your introduction, you said, we've got to change this assault on energy. What lifted billions of people out of poverty, as you said a few minutes ago, was the advent of the Industrial Revolution. The best proxy that we have in economic data to measure human prosperity is actually per capita energy consumption. This chart shows per capita energy consumption in the United States. And as you can see here, from the end of World War II until about 1974, we were in a steady uptrend of per capita energy consumption and therefore standard of living. But something happened around 1974 that caused this chart to flatline for the balance of the 20th century. And for the entirety of the 21st century, or at least the first quarter of it, we've been on a steady and slow decline in our per capita energy consumption. What we've got to do is get off of this mindset, which is well-meaning but misplaced and misguided, that we have to conserve energy. And what we've got to say is, no, we've got to stop polluting the planet and releasing greenhouse gases as we increase our consumption of energy. What we've done is, after the last 25 years of government subsidies, we've spent about $5 trillion with a T on renewable energy, primarily wind and solar. Well, as a result of that big investment, wind and solar now serves almost 5% of global energy demand. It's significant. I mean, it's almost 5%. But it is also not enough. How much have we reduced our consumption of coal, oil, and natural gas, which are the three primary fossil fuels? The answer is coal, oil, and natural gas consumption is still going up every single year. We've reduced coal, oil, and gas consumption by exactly zero. That's a really big problem. Furthermore, the wind and solar that we're producing is intermittent supply, and it's causing all kinds of problems. Now, just in the last week before we recorded this, probably a couple weeks before this airs, there was a gigantic power outage where all of a sudden, with almost no warning, Portugal and Spain are taken completely offline. What happened there was they had really big intermittent supply sources that are not reliant on spinning turbines in order to make the electricity. So in other words, we're using wind and solar, which use inverters in order to make their electricity. And it basically, by trying to fit this square peg of intermittent supply into the round hole of baseload demand, we glitched the power grid and we ended up with Spain and Portugal offline for a couple of days. We ought to be supplying the baseload demand with baseload energy sources. Now, there are some renewable sources like hydropower that are well suited to baseload demand. Another one is geothermal, which unfortunately is not economic. But intermittent sources like wind and solar are not well suited to running the grid or running most of the supply in the grid. And events like we just had in Spain and Portugal are just warning signs that we're taking the wrong approach here. Hydropower works very well. Just one problem with hydropower: we've already figured it out and we've already developed all the opportune hydropower development places around the world. It's already been built out every place that it makes sense. Tripling nuclear by 2050 is the best policy idea that I've heard in 50 years. We're finally starting to get our act together because somebody had the brilliant idea of saying, look, we just need to put a stake in the ground and make a commitment. Let's triple nuclear by 2050. I'm all for it. The thing is, tripling nuclear doesn't replace all the energy we get from fossil fuels. It doesn't come anywhere close to that. That would be a 24x on nuclear, not a 3x on nuclear. The thing is tripling nuclear by 2050. Now, I contend that we can go a lot farther before 2050, but we need advanced reactor technology to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of setting the goal. The goal needs to be relating to our demand increase, not what might be possible in expanding an existing technology. And if you change that goal, then it's very easy to discard this as insufficient. It may be an important component, but it's insufficient.
Maybe the most important point of this whole episode, which is what's the big tipping point that's going to change everything that the future of humanity hinges on? If you ask the climate crowd, they would say, oh, everybody knows the tipping point. The tipping point is when you get to 1.5 degrees Celsius of temperature rise above the whatever benchmark they used to have from a long time ago. But there's a far more important tipping point that occurs economically when we somehow figure out a way to make nuclear energy cost less than fossil fuel energy, so that we get safe, clean nuclear that costs less than energy from coal and gas. The reason that's a tipping point is the same reason that Henry Ford, when he invented his automobile assembly line, made that decision to bet his entire fortune and his entire reputation on what a lot of people thought was a crazy decision. And Ford said, if I could make it so the common guy could afford one, then everybody would buy one. Well, we need to change the way we think about building nuclear energy, to stop thinking about building a one-of-a-kind or a first-of-a-kind nuclear reactor. Oh, well, let's look at Clinch River in Georgia, and we're going to make that the site where we're going to build a first-of-a-kind breeder reactor. No, we need to be thinking about how we're going to build Henry Ford's assembly line, how we're going to build thousands of Model Ts. And one of the things that means is we've got to choose an advanced reactor design that could become the workhorse of energy transition. It's going to work well in ships. It's going to work well in power plants. It's going to work to power aircraft carriers. It's going to be able to power mining villages in the middle of nowhere. It's going to be able to be the core power unit that goes into large power plants. We're going to reuse that same reactor design for a zillion different things. We've got to come up with one standard workhorse reactor that meets most of the needs, that can produce energy that's cheaper than energy from coal and gas. Let's stop oil. Let's replace it with not the old school nuclear, but new school nuclear, new advanced nuclear that's going to be safer, cleaner, not produce the same kind of waste profile that old school nuclear did, and it's going to cost less than energy from coal and gas.
And
if you've got that,
right? Yeah.
The world will switch to nuclear all by itself. It's pure economics.
Your analogy, the idea of a custom car is solving a person's problem who can buy that car, but it's not solving a larger problem. It's not solving a societal problem. So building a nuclear power plant, which is what the 2050 tripling is about, a traditional plant, it's solving somebody's problem, a neighborhood, a local region, whatever, but it's not solving society's problem. Where we're growing too quickly, we need too much energy, and that just it's an insufficient amount of new energy.
What it is it's safe, responsible, clean energy for rich kids. If you're in a country that can afford to say, hey, let's spend $20-30 billion, it is far better than any other kind of energy that we know. It's the best, safest, cleanest kind of energy that exists on planet Earth today. And that means that impoverished places take exported Australian coal and burn it, and it's going to go straight into the atmosphere, and Australians are going to end up breathing the same smoke as if they had burned the coal in their own country. So until we can make nuclear cost less than fossil fuels, we're not providing a systemic solution for humanity. Conventional nuclear costs somewhere between $50 and $150 per megawatt hour of consumption. We can get it down to less than $25, so about half of what energy from coal and gas costs. That's going to require creating an entire industry, just as Henry Ford created assembly lines, the way that we build automobiles.
Can we take 2 seconds, because there are probably many people, as I always was, that just thought that nuclear was too dangerous because things can melt down and the cost of a meltdown is too much. And growing up, that seemed to be the reason that regulators slowed to a stop all of the development of new nuclear reactors. We're talked about the safety issues, where they were, where they stand, and whether the conventional nuclear has a better technology that is less likely to break down in the future.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because it is what the public is obsessed with. First of all, the nuclear that we already have, conventional nuclear, it's the latest generation of these old school nuclear power plants. It's still old nuclear technology. It was developed in the 1950s. It's been around for a very long time. But they've added automation and passive safety features that have really changed the face of it. And unfortunately, the sad history is there was never really anything wrong with nuclear reactor technology. People think, oh, this happened. Well, what about Fukushima? What about Chernobyl? What about 3 Mile Island? Those are the big events that everybody talks about. Each of those 3 reactors, Bob, had a horrible, horrible design flaw. Do you know what the design flaw was?
I've read about it, but I'll let you tell me.
They have control rooms that allow human beings to take charge of systems and make them do things other than the things that they were designed to do. In every single one of those big accidents, what happened? The first big accident was 3 Mile Island in the United States. So you have a nuclear reactor that's operating about a week after a movie came out, the China Syndrome. What happens is they start to have a loss of coolant accident. Some of the coolant leaks out. The automated systems automatically turned on the emergency core coolant pumps in order to prevent a meltdown. What happens next? The human operator turns the coolant pump off, because the human operators convinced themselves that they didn't really have a loss of coolant accident, which is what the automated system was responding to, and it was better to turn the coolant pumps back off. Well, as soon as you turn the coolant pumps off in a loss of coolant accident, which is what was happening, you end up with a partial meltdown scenario and almost having a very serious accident that was completely unnecessary.
Which is also key, because as I remember, it was almost an accident that cost a lot of money, but it didn't cause any health impact,
no,
right?
It didn't hurt anybody. Nobody got injured. Yeah. Even after, if you take the most conservative estimates of radioactive steam released into the atmosphere, it may have made long-term cancers slightly more prevalent, so there may have been a few more occurrences of cancers in that community on some statistical level that would pale in contrast to what would happen if you had a coal mine in that town where you have a whole bunch of exposure. And it's another thing that people are very concerned about radioactive emissions. Yeah. What about the radiation? I'm so worried. What they don't realize is we do have a serious problem with radioactive contamination being released from power plants. That's a real issue. Okay, the thing that people don't realize is the only power plants that release radioactive contamination are coal-fired power plants, because the coal ash that comes out the smokestack of those things is radioactive. And there is radioactive emissions in that could cause health problems for people. So nuclear power plants are the safest form of energy ever conceived. It's much, much safer than coal or natural gas or even wind. It's about tied with solar, and it's a funny thing. Solar was safer than nuclear because the statistics are based on so few events. They're both so safe that nuclear was statistically slightly more dangerous because of a construction accident that happened building a thing. And then there was some solar facility, and a guy fell off a ladder and broke his neck. One guy died, and it changed it, and that made solar more dangerous than nuclear. It's because of one accident that threw things off. The point is, it's completely safe. It always has been.
That was where I was going. Is if you bother to take a look at the actual statistics, then nuclear becomes the safest technology, electricity generating technology that's been invented, and it's not the reputation at all.
Well, and the thing is, James Fonda was very effective. They started with, it's dangerous, the radiation's going to get you. That was the big scare of the 70s. When that kind of got debunked, what they switched to is the waste. It's all about the waste.
Yep.
The waste is a policy problem. And I have to admit, even in my, you can see behind me, the energy transition crisis, which is on my shirt too, was my docu-series. When I produced that, I got the nuclear waste story completely wrong. What I always thought was someday, hopefully, somebody will invent a way that we could recycle this stuff and not have to keep it piled up forever. But until that day comes, I think this nuclear waste is a real problem. Well, guess what? The someday happened in the 1940s. Nuclear waste reprocessing was the plan from the beginning. That's what they wanted to do. Was it's called a closed fuel cycle, where we would take the spent nuclear fuel, run it through a reprocessing facility, and use that spent fuel to fuel new reactors. By the end of the 1960s in New York State, we were operating spent nuclear fuel reprocessing facilities. We actually had them up and running. We spent about $500 million building a gigantic one in maybe North Carolina, southeastern United States. We built a gigantic one. Just before it was due to be commissioned, this would allow us to have completely gotten rid of all of our nuclear waste, not had any. President Jimmy Carter banned all nuclear waste reprocessing and made it illegal, and then employed Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act, which basically is a treaty mechanism that allows the United States to forbid the rest of the free world from doing it. Now, France responded with a great big middle finger to that. The reason they were able to do that was because Charles de Gaulle had refused to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty because he correctly understood that it was not just trying to protect the world from, nuclear weapons proliferation. It was putting all of the power in the hands of the United States and the Soviet Union, which France had always objected to. So Charles de Gaulle refused to sign initially. France is now part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but they waited until 1992 when they had become an acknowledged nuclear weapons state because they knew that would exempt them from being restricted in their ability to reprocess nuclear fuels. Because right now the edict from the United States is nobody other than recognized nuclear weapons states is allowed to do any enrichment or reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel waste.
What happened in Chernobyl?
What happened at Chernobyl was they were trying to do a test that they had botched 3 times previously, that they had not run past the designers of the reactor, that they had not run past the regulator, and they came up with a test plan. A whole bunch of things went wrong during the course of the day. They got the reactor down to about 20% power. They couldn't figure out why it wasn't producing full power. In the course of, and it's eerie, the similarity to 3 Mile Island. In the course of trying to get the reactor back online, they disabled the emergency core coolant system because they knew they weren't going to need it that day. And they figured in order to do their test, they could just leave it turned off. So they disabled their emergency core coolant system. And it was about 1 o'clock in the morning when a 25-year-old operator with 6 months of experience on the job was operating the reactor, made a whole bunch of really serious mistakes. The reactor was never broken. It was never malfunctioning in the sense of, it was working the way it was designed to work. In the case of Fukushima, Fukushima in Japanese, what happened there was they screwed up by the numbers at that plant. Their safety inspectors picked up on it and wrote them up several times for a period of years before that accident. So a lot of people will say, oh, it was an act of God. It was an unforeseeable event. Bullshit. Safety regulators came in years before, in 2008, and said, look, you're in an obvious tsunami exposure zone. You've got to think about protecting this plant from the worst possible tsunami risk. It's got to be survivable. That means your emergency backup generators that run those same emergency core coolant pumps that keep the reactor safe, you've got to have those absolutely bulletproof. You've got a backup generator here, which is great, but your backup generator is located in the basement of the turbine building that could easily get flooded. Bad place for it. You've got to relocate it on higher ground. 5 years before the accident ever happened, safety inspectors foresaw all of those events. They wrote it all up. They did relocate the generators to higher ground. It wasn't higher enough. They still got flooded. But they also failed to relocate the switching equipment that switched the generators on. That was still in the basement where it did get flooded before anything else could happen. And then I think the generators themselves got flooded too. So they completely ignored safety inspectors. You have a nuclear power industry.
Problem. Are these water-cooled conventional nuclear power plants designed better with these problems in mind going forward?
Yes, they are much, much safer. The new generation of conventional light water reactors. Let me see if I can get
that makes sense.
A slide for that. They're called Generation 3, or Generation 3 Plus is the very latest one. What's different about them is two things. It's still 1950s light water reactor technology that's making the energy. What's going on is, in the original designs, the assumption was if the human operator knows best, if they can use the manual valves and switches to do absolutely anything they want. The new plants are designed where Homer Simpson couldn't screw it up if he tried. You couldn't do anything.
Well, that's comforting. I was hoping to hear something like that.
Well, I mean, that's what we need to get to, is we need to get to idiot-proofing this stuff. The new nuclear plants won't allow, even a malicious operator who was trying to cause an accident probably couldn't get the latest generation 3+ nuclear power plant to go into a meltdown mode, because there is no switcher control that you could manipulate to make that happen. So they're much safer than they used to be. The thing is, they still produce the waste, and they still cost more than fossil fuels. Those are the problems that we've got to solve.
Exactly. And the cost is also upfront, unfortunately, in gigantic amounts, so that the returns on that capital is delayed. Is it worth discussing the various types right now?
The problem we're trying to solve is the old kind costs too much and it takes too long to build. So what's the solution? Believe it or not, McDonald's restaurants gives us an excellent case study. McDonald's can build a new restaurant in 24 hours now. How the heck do you build a restaurant in 24 hours? The answer is you don't. The restaurant is pre-manufactured on an assembly line in a factory ahead of time. It gets delivered to the job site as about a half a dozen modules in the form factor of standard 40-foot shipping containers. Those are the containers that you see in the back of the big trucks driving down the highway or on, all loaded on a container ship. You see on this series of pictures here, this is a site for a new McDonald's restaurant at the top left corner. Less than 24 hours later, at the bottom right corner, that restaurant is actually selling hamburgers. How did they do that? They just craned a half a dozen or so of these shipping container-sized modules off the back of flatbed trucks into position. They bolt them together, they connect them to the plumbing and electric mains, throw a switch, and that restaurant is ready to sell hamburgers. Everything else was pre-manufactured ahead of time. We need to build entire nuclear power plants the same way McDonald's builds restaurants. That's my contribution to humanity. We talked in the beginning about if I can sell the world, or if I can popularize this idea that we could build nuclear power stations that cost less than fossil fuel power stations, and we could do it in less than a year by using the same approach that McDonald's uses to build restaurants. There's one thing I want to contribute to this planet for my time here, it's that idea of copy what McDonald's did for restaurants, do the same thing, build entire nuclear power plants that way. Well, what does that mean? It means that we've got to get the major components of a nuclear power plant down to the size of shipping containers. Or something else. I don't want to say this is the only approach, because there's another approach, which is to say, wait a minute, shipping containers are a little bit restrictive because we'd like to build some machines that are bigger than a shipping container. I don't think I like that as much as what if we could get all of the components of a nuclear power plant down to the size of standard shipping containers so that we could build these things anywhere on Earth, just like McDonald's can build a restaurant anywhere on Earth. That's the idea that I like the best. That's the one that I focus the most on. So the goals that I want to achieve for humanity, first, make nuclear energy cost decidedly less than energy from fossil fuels. That's the tipping point that I say is more important than 1.5 degrees Celsius, because it's when it costs less that all of a sudden you can say, okay, forget about just the most expensive, well-off countries. So I want to build gigawatt-sized nuclear power stations for less than $1,200 per kilowatt of capital expenditure and deliver them in less than 6 months. I think that's possible, and I think that's what changes the world. I want to do that and at the same time eliminate all high-level nuclear waste. What Americans don't realize is that for decades, France has been successfully reprocessing its spent nuclear fuel waste. They use it to make fuel for new reactors, and the small amount of waste that really is waste has a half-life generally of less than 30 years. What we need to get to is mass producing a different kind of nuclear reactor. It's called a breeder reactor, which uses fuel much more efficiently and produces much less waste. And it's also, if we use the right kind of breeder reactors, it can even consume the leftover waste from yesterday's reactors and use it as fuel in order to start up these new reactors. We also need to markedly improve on the nuclear weapons proliferation controls that exist today. On one hand, IAEA is incredibly strict on their rules. All of those safeguards were designed 70 years ago, before there was technology. What they're all based on is this common vision that says we've got to be able to detect a proliferation risk within the first 6 months while we have time to react to it with policy before a rogue nation could get to the point where they're ready to launch a missile and actually fire a nuclear weapon into somebody else's country. If we've got a 6-month warning window, that will be enough. Bob, this is 2025, not 1945. I'm not satisfied with a 6-month window. I want a 6-millisecond window where any equipment which is designed that it could possibly have any chance of ever being repurposed to do anything remotely close to making weapons grade plutonium or uranium or anything else. I want RSA encrypted secure communications with the mothership so that we know at the global IAEA Oversight Center, not in 6 months, but in 6 milliseconds.
Yeah.
As
Alarm
soon
bells
as
everywhere.
anything happens that's out of the ordinary, I want the alarm bells going off. Now, when you have something like a nuclear reactor that's in someone else's possession, you can't possibly safeguard completely against them potentially, taking the parts and using it to build something else. But what you can do, you can make it tamper evident, and you can make it tamper evident in real time. So we could dramatically improve on all of these sacred rules of the IAEA and enlighten them with modern technology so that they're much more effective than they were ever conceived to be before that. So I already talked about the big point that I wanted to make, which is scale determines cost. This is the nuclear Henry Ford moment, which is the title of a Substack post that I wrote on my Substack. If you want to know more detail, it's all in there. We need to make nuclear energy cost less than energy from coal and gas. Why is that important? Because when we do, demand will be unlimited. I'm going to give you one example here. This is not the only example, and this is not fully proven technology, but one company that I've invested in as an angel investor called Copenhagen Atomics has a vision of saying, well, wait a minute. Since the shipping container is the unit of what's transmittable around the world with our existing container ship-based infrastructure of logistics, let's make the container the form factor of a nuclear reactor. Let's build nuclear reactors that are shipping container-shaped nuclear reactors. Their vision of that is you get one nuclear reactor you see at the bottom of this diagram here being delivered by truck to this nuclear gigawatt nuclear power plant. The way you build a gigawatt nuclear power plant is the same way that McDonald's builds a restaurant. You just bring in the modules in shipping container-sized units. So this truck arrives. There's a crane here that's built into the building. The truck pulls into that bay there. It lifts the container off. It gets put into one of these tubes. The tubes are called cocoons. They serve the same purpose that a containment building serves in a conventional nuclear power plant. The idea is that the cocoon is going to absorb any nuclear radiation, any radiation that comes out of the reactor is going to get absorbed in that. The rest of the building doesn't need to be built to nuclear standards because it's just like a Walmart. It's a big box retail building. It doesn't have to be a specialized nuclear concrete building. It could be a tin-sided building. All of the nuclear guts are contained inside of those little brown tubes there called cocoons. The idea here is that you make a gigawatt-sized power plant by taking about 25 or 30 smaller shipping container-sized nuclear reactors and ganging them together. That means each one of them doesn't have a control room. There is no Homer Simpson sitting in the control room full of knobs and switches. It's all automated and computer controlled, and it's remotely managed. So this building here basically forms a gigawatt-sized power plant, but all of the nuclear reactors were mass-produced in a factory on an assembly line someplace else. There's a Gigafactory. I would say off the top of my head, it's probably in South Korea because South Koreans are really good at nuclear energy and they're really good at mass production of automobiles on assembly lines. Perfect place to really get the right technologies together to build nuclear reactors in the form factor of standard 40-foot shipping containers. So build it on a factory, a fully robotic assembly line, in a factory is my vision of how this should happen. That Gigafactory someplace is going to cost at least $10 billion to build. It will be the most sophisticated, amazing factory in the course that the world has ever seen. And it will change the world more than any Gigafactory ever has because it's where we will build all of the nuclear reactors that we need to replace fossil fuels. This factory, by the way, needs to run, if it's going to produce, this is a staggering statistic. When I met the guy who founded Copenhagen Atomics, he told me he wanted to build nuclear reactors on an assembly line at the rate of 1 per day. I said, 1 per day? This industry is
That's not an assembly line.
I said, well, this industry has only built about 413 nuclear reactors in 75 years. And you want to build one a day? That's a lot. Well, then I sat down and did the math. And I said, no, if you want to build enough to fully replace all the energy we get from fossil fuels with nuclear, you'd have to build 1 per hour for 14.7 years, running 24/7, 365.
1 per day is a good start.
It's a good start. It would just barely be one per hour.
You need more.
1 per hour is just barely enough to take 15 years. So if we're going to go from now to 2050, we're going to spend 10 years at least developing this technology, building the Gigafactory. By the time we're actually producing reactors at the rate of 1 per hour, that only leaves us 15 years left to get to 2050.
Thanks for watching this first episode of our deep dive into the future of energy. Today, we explored why abundant energy is essential to human prosperity, why wind and solar haven't scaled effectively, and why advanced nuclear, especially when mass-produced, offers a revolutionary solution. But this is only the beginning. I'll be posting future episodes with Erik, where he breaks down his research into thorium reactor technology, the economics that could make it cheaper than fossil fuels, and China's concerning lead in this critical area. We'll also explore what the United States must do to catch up in this high-stakes race for energy dominance. You won't want to miss these upcoming conversations. They're essential viewing for understanding our energy future. Hey, if you like this clip, please hit the subscribe button. You might also want to check out some of the clips I've posted with my many other guests. My interviews all address the simple question, how screwed are we? We ask experts about the problems that make Americans so pessimistic today, but we also explore why there's never been a better time to have been born than today. Join us for perspective on today's challenges and opportunities.